The year was 1964, and while America was caught up in the British invasion and civil rights marches, something far more sinister was brewing in the boardrooms of Detroit and the back offices of NASCAR headquarters. What I'm about to tell you will shake your faith in American racing forever. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Ford 427 single overhead cam, the most feared, most banned, and most deliberately buried engine in American motorsport history. This wasn't just another big block. This was mechanical warfare disguised as innovation. And when the smoke cleared, an entire racing dynasty had been destroyed by politics, fear, and what can only be described as institutional sabotage. You think you know the story of NASCAR's golden age? Brother, you don't know squat until you understand how one engine, one magnificent, terrifying piece of American engineering, was systematically erased from racing history because it was simply too damn good for anyone's comfort. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. The story of how Ford built a monster so powerful, so dominant, that NASCAR officials, GM executives, and even government regulators conspired to kill it before it could change everything forever. Picture this: Daytona International Speedway, February 1965. The Daytona 500, America's greatest stock car race, is about to witness something that would send shockwaves through the entire automotive establishment. Mario Andretti, behind the wheel of a Holman Moody Ford Galaxy, isn't just leading the pack. He's absolutely demolishing it. While other drivers are nursing their engines through the banking, praying their motors don't blow before the checkered flag, Andretti's Ford is pulling away like it's powered by rocket fuel. Under the hood sits 427 cubic inches of pure mechanical rebellion, the Ford SOHC, or as insiders called it, the Cammer. This engine wasn't just fast, it was apocalyptically fast. So fast that by lap 150, NASCAR officials were already making phone calls that would change racing forever. What happened next wasn't just a rule change, it was automotive assassination carried out in broad daylight with the full blessing of sanctioning bodies who claimed to represent fair competition. The 427 SOHC would be banned, buried, and systematically erased from official NASCAR history. But here's what they couldn't erase: the truth. And after nearly 60 years of silence, it's time that truth finally saw daylight. To understand the magnitude of what Ford accomplished and what was taken away, you need to understand the battlefield of 1960s American racing. This was the era of the Aero Wars, when manufacturers weren't just building cars, they were building weapons. Chrysler had unleashed their legendary 426 Hemi, an engine so dominant it had already been banned once from NASCAR, only to return with even more vengeance. General Motors was pouring millions into their big block programs, creating monsters like the 427 Mystery Motor that could turn Chevelle into four-wheeled missiles. But Ford was getting their asses handed to them on Sunday, and that meant getting embarrassed in Monday's sales meetings. In Detroit, there was one rule that trumped all others: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And Ford wasn't winning anything. Enter Jacques Pasino, Ford's racing director, and a man who understood that sometimes you don't just need to beat the competition. Sometimes you need to obliterate them so completely that they never recover. Pasino had a vision: build an engine so advanced, so powerful, that it would make everything else on the track look like antiques. The solution came from an unlikely source: Ford's European racing program. While American manufacturers were still stuck in the Stone Age of pushrod valve trains, Ford's engineers in England had been experimenting with overhead cam technology. The results were staggering: more power, higher RPMs, and reliability that made traditional American V8s look like farm equipment. But here's where the story gets interesting. Ford didn't just adapt this technology, they weaponized it. What Ford created in 1964 wasn't just an engine, it was a declaration of war wrapped in cast iron and aluminum. The 427 single overhead cam started with Ford's proven FE big block foundation, but that's where conventional thinking ended. Instead of the traditional pushrod valve train that every other American manufacturer was using, Ford mounted a single overhead camshaft on each cylinder head, operated by a timing chain system that looked like it belonged in a Formula One car, not a stock car. The specifications read like something from a fever dream: 427 cubic inches of displacement, but with the ability to rev to 7,500 RPM when other big blocks were gasping for breath at 6,000. The factory rating was a conservative 616 horsepower, but dyno tests revealed the truth. Properly tuned examples were producing over 700 horsepower, with some race prep versions touching 800. But raw power was just the beginning. The SOHC's overhead cam design allowed for larger valves, better breathing, and more precise timing control. While Chrysler's Hemi was making headlines, Ford's Camry was making those headlines obsolete. The intake valves measured 2.25 inches, massive by 1960s standards. The exhaust valves were equally impressive at 1.90 inches. The compression ratio could be adjusted from 10.5 to 1 for street use all the way up to 12.5 to 1 for all-out racing applications. The camshaft profiles were so aggressive that the engine had a distinctive loping idle that sounded like mechanical thunder. Most impressive of all was the engineering elegance. While other manufacturers were adding complexity to squeeze out more power, Ford had created an engine that was both more powerful and more reliable than anything else on the track. The overhead cam design eliminated the pushrod flex that plagued high RPM operation, while the improved breathing meant the engine could sustain maximum power for entire race distances. Ford's engineers had solved the fundamental problem of American V8 design: how to make massive power while maintaining durability. The answer was European sophistication applied to American displacement, and the results were terrifying to everyone who wasn't wearing a Ford uniform. When the 427 SOHC hit the track in 1965, it didn't just win races, it redefined what winning looked like. The first indication of what was coming happened during testing at Ford's Romeo, Michigan facility. Dick Hutcherson, one of Ford's top development drivers, took a SOHC-powered Galaxy around the test track and immediately radioed back to the pits. "Boys, we've got a problem. This thing is so fast it's scary." He wasn't exaggerating. In initial dyno tests, the SOHC was producing 15 to 20% more power than Chrysler's vaunted 426 Hemi, and it was doing it with better fuel economy and superior reliability. When Ford's racing team ran endurance tests, the SOHC engines were completing 500-mile simulations without missing a beat, while competitor engines were requiring rebuilds every 300 miles. But the real proof came on race day. At Daytona in 1965, Mario Andretti's SOHC-powered Ford didn't just win, it lapped the field. Twice. By the time the checkered flag fell, Andretti was so far ahead that some spectators thought the race had ended early. The dominance continued throughout the 1965 season. Ford drivers weren't just winning races, they were setting records that stood for decades. At Michigan International Speedway, Cale Yarborough's SOHC Ford turned a qualifying lap that was 8 miles per hour faster than the previous track record. At Atlanta Motor Speedway, David Pearson's Ford was so fast that NASCAR officials initially refused to believe the timing equipment was working correctly. Most telling of all was the psychological impact on competitors. Chrysler drivers who had dominated with their Hemi engines just months before were suddenly struggling to stay on the same lap. GM teams were reporting back to Detroit that their engines felt obsolete compared to Ford's new power plant. Richard Petty, NASCAR's king and a Chrysler loyalist, was quoted as saying, "That Ford engine isn't just faster than ours. It's from a different century. We're bringing knives to a gunfight." By mid-season 1965, Ford had won 32 of 40 NASCAR races, with 28 of those victories coming from SOHC-powered cars. It wasn't competition anymore, it was a massacre. What happened next remains one of the darkest chapters in American motorsport history, a story of backroom deals, political pressure, and corporate sabotage that would make Watergate look like a parking ticket. The first warning signs came in July 1965, when NASCAR President Bill France Sr. called an emergency meeting of team owners and manufacturers. The official agenda was competitive balance, but insiders knew the real topic: how to stop Ford's SOHC before it destroyed NASCAR's credibility as a competitive sport. The meeting, held at the Daytona Beach headquarters, was supposed to be confidential, but leaked memos, discovered decades later in a NASCAR executive's estate sale, revealed the shocking truth about what was discussed behind those closed doors. General Motors representatives, led by Chevrolet's racing director Vince Piggins, presented what they called the Ford problem. Their argument was simple. Ford's technological advantage was so overwhelming that it threatened the very existence of stock car racing. Fans wouldn't pay to watch races where the outcome was predetermined, sponsors wouldn't support teams that couldn't compete, and television networks wouldn't broadcast events that lacked drama. But the real pressure came from an unexpected source: the federal government. In 1965, Congress was investigating the automotive industry's role in promoting unsafe driving through racing sponsorship. Senator Abraham Ribicoff, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Executive Reorganization, had already held hearings questioning whether manufacturers should be allowed to use racing to market high-performance vehicles to young drivers. Ford's SOHC dominance had attracted unwanted attention from Washington. Internal documents, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s, show that federal regulators were concerned about Ford's racing success, encouraging excessive speed on public roads. The 427 SOHC, with its 700-plus horsepower capability, was seen as particularly problematic. The solution was elegant in its simplicity: change the rules to eliminate Ford's advantage, but do it in a way that appeared fair and technical rather than punitive. On August 15, 1965, NASCAR announced new engine regulations for the 1966 season. The rules were complex and technical, but the effect was surgical. The 427 SOHC was banned from competition. The official justification was cost containment and technological parity. NASCAR claimed that exotic engine designs like overhead cams were too expensive for smaller teams to compete with, and that stock car racing should remain true to its stock origins. But the real reason was simpler. Ford had built an engine so good that it threatened to end competitive racing forever. What followed the ban was a systematic campaign to erase the 427 SOHC from racing history, a cover-up so thorough that most racing fans today have never heard of the engine that dominated NASCAR for one brief, shining season. Ford's initial response was predictable: outrage. Henry Ford II himself called NASCAR's decision arbitrary and punitive, and threatened to withdraw Ford from all NASCAR competition. Ford's racing director Jacques Pacino was more direct, telling reporters that NASCAR had sold out to General Motors and Chrysler. But the pressure campaign was just beginning. Within weeks of Ford's public protests, the company began receiving visits from federal regulators. The Department of Transportation, newly created in 1966, launched an investigation into Ford's racing activities. The Federal Trade Commission opened an inquiry into whether Ford's racing success constituted unfair competition in the automotive marketplace. Most damaging of all was the IRS audit. Ford's racing program, which had been treated as a legitimate business expense for years, was suddenly reclassified as entertainment, making the costs non-deductible. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Ford's racing budget was effectively cut in half overnight. Faced with regulatory pressure, financial penalties, and the threat of congressional hearings, Ford capitulated. In a September 1966, the company announced it was de-emphasizing its racing programs and would comply with all NASCAR regulations. But the cover-up went deeper than just rule changes and financial pressure. NASCAR began a systematic campaign to minimize the SOHC's achievements. Race records were updated to emphasize driver skill over engine performance. Press releases focused on close competition rather than Ford's dominance. Most tellingly, NASCAR's official histories, published in the 1970s and 1980s, barely mentioned the 427 SOHC at all. The few racing journalists who tried to investigate the story found themselves shut out of NASCAR events. Photographers who had documented SOHC-powered cars found their credentials revoked. Even Ford's own public relations department was instructed to avoid discussing the engine in interviews or press materials. By 1970, it was as if the 427 SOHC had never existed. A generation of racing fans grew up never knowing that Ford had once built an engine so dominant that it had to be banned to preserve competitive racing. Today, nearly 60 years after its brief moment of glory, the Ford 427 SOHC has achieved something its creators never intended. It's become the most valuable and sought-after engine in American automotive history. Original SOHC engines, the few that survived NASCAR's purge, now command prices that would shock the engineers who built them. A complete, numbers-matching 427 SOHC recently sold at Barrett-Jackson for $485,000, more than most people pay for their houses. Even incomplete engines, missing major components, regularly bring six-figure prices at auction. The irony is palpable. The engine that was banned for being too successful has become the ultimate symbol of American automotive achievement. Every major muscle car collection includes at least one SOHC displayed like a religious relic from a lost golden age. But the SOHC's influence extends far beyond collector value. Modern Ford engines, from the Coyote 58 in today's Mustangs to the EcoBoost turbos in F-150s, all trace their technological lineage back to lessons learned from the SOHC program. The overhead cam designs, advanced materials, and precision manufacturing techniques pioneered in the 1960s became standard practice decades later. Most significantly, the SOHC proved that American manufacturers could build engines that matched or exceeded anything from Europe or Japan. The technological sophistication that Ford demonstrated in 1965 wouldn't become commonplace in American engines until the 1990s, but the SOHC proved it was possible 30 years earlier. Racing legends who drove SOHC-powered cars still speak of the engine with reverence bordering on worship. Mario Andretti, now in his 80s, recently told an interviewer that the 427 SOHC was the greatest racing engine ever built by American hands. Cale Yarborough, another SOHC veteran, was more direct. That engine was 20 years ahead of its time. Hell, it might have been 30 years ahead. The story of Ford's 427 SOHC isn't just automotive history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when innovation threatens established power structures. For one brief, shining moment in 1965, Ford's engineers created something truly revolutionary, an American engine that combined European sophistication with Detroit muscle, producing power levels that wouldn't be matched for decades while maintaining reliability that put competitors to shame. But the SOHC's greatest strength, its overwhelming superiority, became its fatal weakness. In a sport that depended on close competition for its entertainment value, dominance was a death sentence. NASCAR, faced with the choice between technological progress and competitive balance, chose balance. The federal government, concerned about racing's influence on public safety, chose regulation over innovation. The result was the systematic destruction of one of America's greatest automotive achievements, a cover-up so thorough that most enthusiasts today have never heard the full story. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the legacy. Every time you see a modern Ford engine with overhead cams, every time you witness a NASCAR race where engines routinely rev to 9,000 RPM, every time you marvel at the technological sophistication of today's performance cars, you're seeing the ghost of the 427 SOHC. The engineers who built that engine in 1964 weren't just creating a racing power plant. They were writing the blueprint for the future of American performance. They proved that Detroit could innovate, that American manufacturers could build engines as sophisticated as anything from Europe, and that given the freedom to pursue excellence, our engineers could create mechanical masterpieces. The tragedy isn't just that the SOHC was banned, it's that we lost 30 years of potential innovation. Imagine if Ford had been allowed to continue developing overhead cam technology in the 1960s. Imagine if that engineering expertise had been applied to street cars, to fuel economy, to emissions control. We might have solved the problems of the 1970s energy crisis with technology instead of regulation. Instead, we got decades of technological stagnation, of push-rod engines that were obsolete before they left the drawing board, of American cars that became synonymous with poor quality and outdated engineering. The SOHC ban didn't just hurt Ford, it hurt the entire American automotive industry. Today, as we face new challenges in automotive technology, electric vehicles, autonomous driving, global competition, the story of the 427 SOHC serves as both inspiration and warning. It shows us what American engineers can accomplish when they're given the freedom to innovate. But it also reminds us how quickly that innovation can be destroyed by politics, fear, and corporate jealousy. The men who built the 427 SOHC are mostly gone now, taking their secrets and their stories with them. But their legacy lives on in every overhead cam engine, every high-revving V8, every piece of American automotive technology that dares to be better than what came before. If you've learned something new about this buried chapter of American automotive history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next week, we're diving into another conspiracy that Detroit doesn't want you to know about. The secret government program that killed Chrysler's 426 Hemi Street cars, and why the EPA's emissions testing was really about eliminating American muscle cars forever. The muscle car wars had more casualties than you ever imagined, and the bodies are still buried in corporate archives and government files. But we're digging them up, one engine at a time. Because the truth about American automotive history isn't found in corporate press releases or sanitized museum displays. It's found in the stories they tried to bury, the engines they tried to ban, and the innovations they tried to kill. The 427 SOHC was just the beginning. Stay tuned, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than you ever imagined. And here's something that'll blow your mind. We've got exclusive access to a private collector who owns one of only 7 surviving 427 SOHC engines that were actually raced at Daytona in 1965. Next month, we're firing it up for the first time in 40 years, and you're going to hear the sound that NASCAR banned forever. That's a sound they never wanted you to hear again. But we're bringing it back because some stories are too important to stay buried.